Everyone blames high house prices on not enough homes, but the data tells a different story. Housing supply barely changed over the last 2 decades, yet prices tripled in some markets. So if it's not supply, what is it? The answer starts with a number most people never look at: how much and how fast a government borrows every year. This has been more obvious in the last few years. When a government runs a large deficit, that new money doesn't just sit still. It moves through the financial system almost immediately. Watch the growth rate of the money supply, and asset prices don't lag behind it by years. They move within months. Housing is one of the first places that money lands, and it's an asset people can borrow heavily against. Once prices start moving, a second force takes over: FOMO. Buyers stop asking, "Can I afford this?" and start asking, "Can I afford to wait?" That psychology doesn't start the price move, but it stretches it out, often well past what the original money creation alone would explain. And it's not just purchase prices. Rents rise too, for the same reason. But being a leased, term-based consumer expense rather than a tradable asset, they take longer to reprice than housing itself. That's what makes this hard to see while it's happening. Official inflation measures like CPI are slow to catch up. Housing costs enter CPI through measures like rent and owner's equivalent rent, and those lag actual market moves by months, sometimes over a year. So while asset prices are already surging, the official inflation number still looks tame. That lag is a big reason the real cause stays invisible until it's already baked into prices. And housing isn't the only asset behaving this way. Watch luxury goods, collectibles, and other scarce assets over the same stretch. They climb too, often in the same window. That's the signature of money moving through an entire system, not a housing-specific supply problem. If the real driver were local, not enough permits, too much immigration, or a birth rate shift, you wouldn't expect watches and art to be rising in the same years. But they are. Because the driver isn't local, it's monetary. But abrupt deficit spending has a cost. Inflation eventually catches up, and when it does, the central bank typically fights back. Demand doesn't fade so much as freeze, with credit growth decelerating, and the Amplify phase flips into reverse. Here's the part almost nobody covers. The common explanation for expensive housing is population growth and undersupply. But when you actually chart it out, population growth explains very little of the price movement. What tracks far more closely with home prices, decade over decade, is the growth of the money supply itself, how much currency and credit exists in the system. That's not a coincidence. When more money is created, through deficit spending, through central bank asset purchases, through cheap credit cycles, that new money has to go somewhere. Housing, as a limited, borrowable, income-generating asset, is one of the primary places it lands. More money chasing a relatively fixed number of homes is a more direct explanation for the last 2 decades of price growth than not enough construction. This is why the debt cycle matters more than most housing commentary admits. It's not a housing story wearing an economics costume. It's a monetary story wearing a housing costume. So the next time someone tells you housing is just about supply and demand, remember, the supply side is real, but it's not the driver. The driver is what happens when a government finances its spending by expanding debt and money. And housing is where that expansion shows up first and hardest for all. Next in our series on what sovereign debt means for you is what happens to your mortgage. The same forces are at work at different speeds. Because housing is so significant, the story can end where it started, with more debt.